Hello, and welcome to the first lesson of our series of classes on the early Latin language. My name is Giuseppe Pezzini. I come from the University of St Andrews in Scotland, or better to say, I teach there and live there with my family, but I am originally from Italy, but I've been living in the United Kingdom for many years. I did train at the University of Oxford, and my doctorate came out in 2015 as a book on criticization on the verb to be in Latin. At the University of St Andrews, pretty town in the north of Edinburgh, I teach mainly Latin language and literature of the Roman Republic, and indeed of the early Latin period in particular. My current project at the moment is an edition and commentary on a very important text by the playwright Terence, who is indeed a very important author of the early Latin period. Together with me, there is Wolfgang de Melo, and I will ask him to introduce himself. He's a dear friend and I've called him for many years.
My name is Wolfgang de Melo and I come from southern Germany. I studied in Oxford and that's in fact where I met Pepe. And my doctoral dissertation was on the early Latin verb system. It came out as a book in 2007. And since then I have edited and translated Plautus, who makes up 60% of early Latin, and have since been working on Varro, our first Roman grammarian, who I have edited, translated and commented on. And I'm now going to leave the stage to my colleague Beppe Pezzini so he can start with the introduction.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. I think we are now ready to begin. I will begin straight away with a general introduction on early Latin. In particular today, we'll address some important questions. First of all, what is early Latin? Second, who were the users of early Latin, when it was spoken, and where it was spoken. First of all, I need to explain what I mean by early Latin, which is actually a quite problematic label to refer to something which is not so easy to define. By early Latin, I refer, of course, to a variety of Latin, that is the language that was originally spoken in the centuries before Christ by people living in Latium, in central Italy, as you can see here from the map. This is basically what was Latium, and in particular, this is the language that was spoken by some particular people living in Latium, that are, of course, the Romans from the city of Rome, which is just here. With the gradual expansion of the Roman power from the 5th, 4th century BC onwards, this language, Latin, became the standard language spoken and written in a vast territory, from Britain to Egypt, by both native and non-native speakers. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD and the gradual emergence of Romance languages as the spoken languages of Europe, Latin maintained all its authority and continued to be used as the lingua franca of culture, especially Western Europe, roughly this region here, until at least the 16th century AD, and in fact beyond then. Texts written in Latin are still produced nowadays. In the past decade, in particular, we have seen a surge in the original production of Latin, both written and spoken, although the users of this language cannot be considered as native speakers, and the Latin normally used and produced in the 21st century is normally a restricted stylistic variety of Latin, that is classical Latin. But what is classical Latin? What do I mean by that? By classical Latin, I refer to an artificial variety of the language which has been codified by grammars of the centuries, and which has been set, especially after the Renaissance, as the standard of correct Latin. This variety is largely based on a selected number of texts produced in the middle-late 1st century BC, including, above all, the rhetorical and philosophical works of Cicero, this man here on the right. However, even the Latin printed in the modern edition of Cicero, the one we read nowadays, has been heavily standardized according to conventions that would have been codified all in the following centuries. And the Latin that was actually written by Cicero would indeed have looked very different to us. Moreover, we know that at the time of Cicero, Latin was not a monolithic entity. There was a huge linguistic variety, lexical, phonological, morphological, syntactic, and Cicero himself could use different varieties of this language in different texts, with different purposes. Therefore, classical Latin, as codified in modern grammars, to a certain extent never existed as a real language. The term should be used to refer not to a diachronic periodization. I prefer to use the words late Republican or Imperial, Rather, classical Latin should be used as a sort of synchronic label to refer to a variety produced and constrained by artificial standardization, which in fact can be attested at all periods of the history of Latin. Standardization of the language is a process indeed which also takes place in our early period. You will forgive me this long preface, but without having these things in mind, it is difficult to understand what is the topic of this module, that is, early Latin. In contrast with classical Latin, I used early Latin in a purely diachronic sense, referring to the Latin used by people living in the territory controlled by the city of Rome between 240-41 BC and 84-83 BC. The geographical coordinates of this territory varied greatly in this period, even in this relatively short period of time. This was for Rome a period of huge political and I will say also cultural expansion. 240 BC is the year following the Roman victory over Carthage in the First Punic War, which resulted in Rome's annexing of its very first province outside Italy, Sicily, and also the affirmation of its naval power over the Western Mediterranean. This conquest had also important linguistic implications, as we will see, since Sicily was a Greek-speaking territory and a cultural hub in many respects. On the other hand, 84 BC is instead the year following the Roman victorious campaign over King Mithridates in the First Mithridatic War, which was marked in particular by a momentous siege of the city of Athens. This victory, we may say, definitely secured Roman control over Greece and the coast of Asia Minor. The chronological boundaries of this period, however, have not just been chosen for political reasons, but rather cultural. 240 BC is the official birth date of Latin literature, when, according to tradition, the Greek former slaves Livius Andronicus put on stage at Rome the very first Latin translation of a Greek tragedy. This was the beginning of an outburst of literary production in the Latin language, which makes up for us most of the linguistic evidence preserved from that period. I will see better in the next lesson, the amount of Latin texts which have been preserved before 240 BC is very, very small. On the other hand, 84-83 BC is the probable year in which Cicero, the man we met before, composed his very first work in his early 20s, that is a rhetorical handbook titled De Inventione. For better or worse, Cicero marks a transition to a new period, because of his later influence on the codification of classical Latin, also because his generation witnessed the end of the previous political system, the end of the Republic, but also just because of the fact that the Ciceronian corpus is larger than everything that has been preserved in Latin from earlier ages. Compared to the corpus of Cicero, the corpus of early Latin is relatively small. The periodization underpinning the concept of early Latin is purely artificial, however. It should be approached with three important caveats. First, it is wrong to assume that the Latin used in the early period is substantially different from that used by Cicero. In fact, there are many linguistic features which have been traditionally associated with early Latin versus classical Latin, which are in fact also well attested in Cicero, well attested in imperial sources, often but not always in low register and substandard sources. Second point, it is wrong to take early Latin as a monolithic entity and assume that all the linguistic features described as early are attested in all the early authors, nor that all these features have all the same stylization. For instance, many linguistic features, which are normally considered early, are found in Plautus, but are not found, say, in Terence. Actually, we know that Terence avoided these features. But even in Plautus himself, we know that some of these early features are often restricted to specific metrical position, where they should probably be construed as stylized archaisms. Third, the nature of the text preserved from the early period presents some particular features, as regards in particular genre and style, and these may distort our linguistic perception. In particular, as Wolfgang already said, the vast majority of the early Latin corpus is made up of the comedies of Plautus and Terence. These are mimetic texts, supposed to imitate low-register spoken varieties of Latin with no equivalents in imperial or late period to be compared with. These comedies contain many linguistic features, that are not attested, say, by Cicero or Caesar, which however are in fact general features of the spoken, conversational Latin of all times, and were presumably avoided by Cicero and Caesar as too colloquial rather than archaic. Similar, the early Latin author Cato, another important source for the period, was a kind of traditionalist, obsessed with the preservation of the ancient customs of Rome. It is not surprising that his works preserve many archaic features which are avoided, say, by his contemporaries. They will presumably have been obsolete in the spoken language of his time. To give one example, which somehow incorporates all the three above consideration, this is the example of the archaic genitive AI. I say archaic, not early, and there is a reason why. In early Latin, there are many instances of the Old Latin ending of the genitive singular ai. This, of course, deserves to be noted. Should we consider all these instances as a sign that this particular morphological ending was a specific trait of early Latin? Not really. Because, for instance, in Ennius, one of the most important authors of the period, this form, this genitive form, is mostly found at the end of the line, where archaisms normally gather. In Plautus, instead, this form is normally found in elevated, high-style passages, such as prologues or formal speeches. In Terence, it is only attested twice. The form, the monosyllabic form, has become the standard one. In contrast, I find it very interesting, the ending ai, this archaic feature, is standard in a classical poet or late Republican poet like Lucretius, which is more common than the classical form ae. He also found in many authors after Lucretius, including the poetry of Cicero himself and many others. All that said, I think we are ready to start describing the linguistic features of early Latin, with the awareness that many of these are not just early, and many of these are indeed early but are stylized already as archaic. We will talk more about all this in the next video, in which I'll present to you the writing and the main sources of early Latin. Thank you for your attention, take care, goodbye, and as we say in early Latin, gratia vobis or gratia tibi ago.